The cold afternoon dragged on in Los Angeles. The sharp wind swept through the streets of Skid Row, one of the most desolate places in the United States. Barron Trump sat in the back seat of his luxury car, lost in thought, until something caught his eye. Amid the dirty sidewalks between makeshift tents and faces marked by suffering, he saw a woman hunched over, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket. There was something about her that stirred his memories, an uncomfortable, almost painful feeling. He frowned, trying to understand why his heart suddenly tightened in his chest. Life can change in the blink of an eye. Today we live in comfort, but what about tomorrow? In 2 years, 5 years, a twist of fate could take us from the top straight to rock bottom. Barron knew this, but he had never seen it so clearly until now. He turned away for a moment, trying to shake off the unease, but he couldn't. There was something about that woman he couldn't ignore. Her eyes were sunken, her skin worn with time and sadness, as if life had drained everything that once made her shine. And then, in a split second, it hit him like a thunderbolt. He knew who she was. The realization struck him like a punch to the gut. It was Mrs. Henderson, his childhood teacher, the woman who had taught him to read, who had believed in him when no one else seemed to care. He blinked a few times, trying to process the scene. How was this possible? How could someone so noble, who dedicated her life to shaping young minds, end up here in this urban hell? His chest tightened with a crushing weight. Something was deeply wrong with the world when people like her were abandoned and forgotten. His eyes returned to the woman, and at that moment, he knew. He couldn't just walk away. The car slowed. Down at the red light, Barron leaned forward, his heart pounding, his mind racing. A lump formed in his throat as he watched her struggle to keep the blanket over her shoulders, trying to escape the biting cold that swept through the city at dusk. Her thin fingers trembled. This wasn't right. A voice in his head told him to keep driving, that it wasn't his problem, that he should return to the comfort of his routine. But another voice, stronger and more insistent, one that he couldn't ignore, told him that he had no choice but to act. Mrs. Henderson's life had once been completely different. She lived in a simple but cozy house in Pasadena, California, dedicating her days to teaching. Every morning she would wake up early, prepare a strong cup of coffee, and go over her lesson plans for the day. Her job wasn't just about teaching, it was about shaping character, instilling hope and inspiring dreams. Life, like a merciless storm, swept away everything she had built. First came the illness, a cruel diagnosis that forced her to leave the classroom. Then the most painful blow of all, her husband's sudden death. The only comfort she had left were her 2 adult children, who promised to take care of her. Promises that in time turned to dust. She never imagined her own children would abandon her. At first, they called often, checked on her, assured her they would figure things out. But as the months passed, the calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. When her health worsened, she had no choice but to sell her house to cover medical expenses. She believed that at the very least, she would have her children's support. But when she reached out for help, she was met with excuses and silence. They had their own lives, they couldn't carry that burden. Each rejection was like a dagger to the heart. That was when she realized she was truly alone. With no money, no family, and no strength left to work, despair consumed her. A social assistance shelter became her last option. At first she felt ashamed, but she kept telling herself it was temporary, that she would find a way out. But life had no mercy. The shelter was a hostile place, filled with screaming in the middle of the night, constant threats, and a daily battle for food. She began to fear the darkness. Still, she endured, until fate decided to deal her one last cruel blow. A fire ripped through the building, destroying everything she had left. She lost it all. The last remnants of her life, her documents, photos of her husband, a small suitcase of clothes, were turned to ashes. That was how she ended up in Skid Row, the place where people lose even their last shreds of hope. The stench of filth clung to the air, and the streets were a battlefield between hunger, cold, and fear. She asked herself every day how she had gotten there. How could a respected teacher, someone who had shaped so many young minds, end up discarded like this? The answer was too painful to accept. But the worst part wasn't the hunger, or the cold, or the illness. It was the loneliness. Nights in Skid Row were an endless nightmare. The cold cut through her skin like knives, and the hard ground where she slept was covered in dirt and discarded trash. The air was thick with the stench of urine, mold, and despair. Each night brought a new danger: violent fights, desperate screams, and the terrifying sound of footsteps creeping closer in the dark. She slept clutching a filthy old bag of clothes, as if it could somehow protect her. But nothing could. Danger was everywhere, and fear had become her only constant companion. She started avoiding eye contact with people. At first, she tried to hold on to some dignity, wearing the least tattered clothes, trying to wash up at public faucets. But she quickly realized that none of it mattered anymore. The city had turned its back on her, and the world saw her as a problem, not a person. Whenever she asked for help, people looked away, crossed the street, pretended she didn't exist. Being ignored hurt more than the cold. As time passed, she could feel herself disappearing, fading from the world's view. She wondered if she was still someone, or just another forgotten body among the many lost souls of Los Angeles. Hunger gnawed at her insides. She never imagined a day would come when she'd have to dig through trash cans for food. The first time she did it, she felt a lump in her throat and a crushing wave of shame. But hunger was ruthless, and humiliation became routine. The rare moments of luck came when she managed to get a piece of bread from a kind soul, or when a volunteer handed out meals. But those moments weren't guaranteed. There were nights when she went to sleep without eating, too weak to even move, feeling her body wither away. Time stripped away more than just her strength. It took her hope, her faith, her identity. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who had once been respected and looked up to, was now invisible to the world. Even her own voice had lost its power. She barely spoke, whispering only when necessary. Her eyes, once filled with knowledge and compassion, now reflected only emptiness. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. But on that cold day, sitting on a filthy sidewalk, wrapped in a thin blanket, she had no idea that a familiar face was about to change everything. Barron Trump's car stopped at a red light, but his mind was elsewhere. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and his heart pounded as he confirmed what his eyes were seeing. The woman curled up on the sidewalk, trembling in the cold, was Mrs. Henderson, his teacher, the woman who had once taught him more than just lessons. From a book, she had taught him about integrity, about believing in himself, about kindness, and now there she was, reduced to a shadow of who she used to be. Barron felt his throat tighten. He blinked a few times, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. But it was. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, ignoring the curious glances from passers-by. Each step toward her felt heavier than the last. He had no idea what to say, no idea if she would even remember him. His heart pounded as he stopped just in front of her and, with a voice that barely held together, said, "Mrs. Henderson." The woman took a moment before lifting her head. Her eyes were hollow, exhausted, but for a brief second, a flicker of recognition appeared. "Barron?" Her voice was weak, almost a whisper, filled with both shock and something else, shame. Her eyes welled up with tears. She instinctively tried to hide her dirty hands, to smooth down her disheveled hair, as if she could somehow erase what she had become. But there was no way to hide it. What hurt wasn't just being recognized, it was being recognized by one of her former students, someone who had once seen her as a figure of strength and wisdom. She didn't want him to see her like this, broken, forgotten, discarded by the world. But Barron didn't look away. Instead, he really saw her, saw everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The past and present collided in a way neither of them had expected. Barron took a deep breath. There was no time to hesitate. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. She looked at him with uncertainty, like someone who had been let down too many times to believe in hope again. But Barron didn't wait for an answer. He simply extended his hand. And in that moment, without a word, a silent choice was made. Mrs. Henderson hesitated before taking Barron's hand. Her eyes darted between his face and the harsh reality surrounding her. Life had taught her not to trust, not to expect kindness. But there he was, a face from her past, holding out a promise she wasn't sure she could believe in. Shame still burned in her chest. She didn't want him to see her like this, but exhaustion was stronger. With a heavy sigh, she accepted his hand. It was the first time in years someone had touched her without disgust. Barron led her to his car, and the silence between them spoke volumes. He saw the frailty in her movements, the way her bones pressed against her thin skin, the way she trembled even in the warmth of the vehicle. His chest tightened. It was like looking at someone who had lost every battle and never had the chance to recover. As he drove, he finally broke the silence. What happened? His voice was softer than he expected. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to answer. She told him everything. The illness, the death of her husband, the betrayal of her children, the slow and merciless descent into homelessness. Every word was a dagger to Barron's heart. He wanted to believe things like this didn't happen to good people. But reality was cruel. Pain doesn't choose its victims. When she mentioned the fire that took the last remnants of her life, Barron felt his throat tighten. He couldn't imagine what it felt like to lose everything, to have your very identity reduced to ashes. But what shocked him the most wasn't the story itself, it was how she told it. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just exhaustion. When Mrs. Henderson finished, her gaze remained fixed on the window. Maybe she expected him to judge her, to say it was her fault, that she should have done something differently. But Barron only gripped the steering wheel tighter, a storm of emotions raging inside him. He couldn't accept that this was the end of her story. His expression hardened. There was something he could do, and he would, for gratitude, for justice, for her. Barron drove straight to a 5-star hotel without a second thought. Mrs. Henderson glanced around, confused. She didn't ask any questions, but her face said it all. She didn't belong here. "Come on," Barron said firmly as he stepped out of the car. She hesitated. Her feet were dirty, her clothes torn. She felt out of place. But Barron wasn't going to let her resist. "Please," he said, holding out his hand again. This time she didn't hesitate. Inside the hotel, people stole quick glances, some whispering. But Barron didn't care. He walked straight to the front desk and booked the best available room. A hot bath, a fresh meal, a safe place to sleep. That was the bare minimum. Mrs. Henderson wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. When they reached the room, she turned to Barron and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Her voice carried a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Barron took a deep breath and smiled. "Because you never gave up on me. Now, it's my turn." Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to say she didn't need this, but it would have been a lie. She needed it more than anything. She stepped into the bathroom, and for the first time in years felt warm water wash over her. Her fingers touched her reflection in the mirror. She barely recognized herself. When she emerged, clean, wearing fresh clothes, and with a meal waiting, for her she felt something she hadn't in a long time: dignity. She looked at Barron, and for the first time, she believed this was real. But Barron knew this was only the beginning. He didn't want to help her for just one night. He wanted to give her life back. Phone in hand, he started making calls. Lawyers, doctors, social workers. He was going to make sure she had a future. But deep down, he knew the biggest change wasn't just happening to her. Something inside him had changed forever, too. The morning sunlight streamed softly through the hotel window, bathing the room in a golden glow. Mrs. Henderson opened her eyes slowly, and for a moment forgot where she was. The soft mattress, the clean sheets, the quiet around her. This wasn't Skid Row. As the realization hit her, a tightness filled her chest. She didn't know how to thank him, but more than that, she wasn't sure if she deserved this. Barron entered the room with a light smile. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. She nodded, still processing everything that had happened. In the days that followed, he moved mountains for her. He secured medical care, a safe place for her to stay, and even financial assistance to help her rebuild. But the most precious gift he gave her wasn't material. It was the feeling that she mattered, that someone still believed in her, that she wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, she felt like a person again. Weeks later, Mrs. Henderson was almost unrecognizable. She looked like a new person, not because of her clothes, but because she had hope. Barron had helped her find a role at a community program, teaching underprivileged children. When she held a piece of chalk in her hand again, it felt like part of her soul had come back to life. When asked why he did all this, Barron's answer was simple. She taught me to be someone. It was my turn to give back. Their reunion wasn't a coincidence. It was proof that small acts of kindness can change lives. And sometimes the best way to show gratitude for what we've been given is to extend a hand to those who once lifted us up. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this journey of compassion and redemption made you feel. Don't forget to hit the like button so more people can be reached by this powerful message. And of course, subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can spread more hope into the world. Thank you for being part of our community.